So welcome everyone. I'm Hannah. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Blue Hill Library. And I just wanted to say a quick good evening and thanks for joining us virtually tonight. We're very excited to have author Fred Hill to speak about his new book, Dereliction of Duty. He is a fellow Bowdoin graduate and resident of Maine since retiring from the State Department back in 2006. He was a journalist for 20 years, including as an investigative reporter, and he's also been an advisor to Republican Senator Charles Mac Mathias. Is that how you say that, Fred? You have to say it.
Yes, yes. His nickname was Mac, so it was called Mac Mathias.
And he's just written this book, so we're excited to have him here to share his thoughts on the Trump presidency. We will have Q&A at the end, and I encourage everyone to bring whatever perspectives you have to the discussion, as long as we can keep it respectful and kind. But for now, we will pass it over to Fred to start with sharing his thoughts.
Thank you, Hannah, very much. I'm sorry we can't do it in person. My wife and I always love to get down to that part of the world. We live near Bath, but certainly Blue Hill and that whole part of Maine is fascinating and very enjoyable. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this book. It's based on my op-ed columns for a number of papers across the country, but mainly the Dallas Morning News and the Baltimore Sun, but also the Bangor Daily News and the Portland Press Herald. I didn't plan to write a lot of op-eds and essays after I'd stopped writing them for the Bangor Daily News in about 2008. I wrote a few during the Obama administration, including several critical of his policies on Syria. But I became very concerned about the state of our nation and the civil discourse, when Donald John Trump emerged as the leading Republican candidate in 2016. My concern grew when 50 of the most respected national security experts in the country, every one of them Republican, published a statement in 2016, I believe in early August, that warned that if elected, Mr. Trump would become the, quote, most reckless, quote, and most dangerous president in American history. My concern deepened as the campaign witnessed Trump's abusive rhetoric, which hasn't changed, against other GOP candidates and against his Democratic opponent, Hillary Clinton, his lack of understanding of complex issues, his 5 closest advisors, none of whom I recognized after working at high levels of the State Department for 20 years. He had one guy, I think Carter Page, who was practically living in Moscow, and no wonder they were wondering about what was going on. And then also his invitation of Russian interference. I want to underline before I go any farther that I'm not a partisan Democrat. I've been a Republican 3 times in my life, one in total innocence after college, when I didn't know much about anything except what I'd learned at Bowdoin in government classes. I was advisor to Charles Mac, who was his foreign affairs director for 2 years, 1985 and 86. He's a very respected moderate Republican. In the last 20 years since I've retired, in the 20 years I was at the State Department, I was in charge of a wargaming office that looked at national security issues and global issues, and 12 of the 20 years were under 3 Republican presidents, Reagan, the 2 Bushes, and then 8 years under Clinton. And I would add just something I tell some of my Republican friends who say I'm liberal. In 2008, I believe, during the Obama-McCain election campaign, I wrote an article saying that George H.W. Bush had been the most effective president in foreign policy since Dwight Eisenhower. And I backed it up with his restraint during the collapse of the Soviet Union, his success in Desert Storm, not going too far and trying to occupy Iraq, the reunification of Germany, and other issues. He actually was really tough on the Middle East as well. Rather than discuss this book in detail, I think it's most appropriate for me to focus on 3 broad but critical issues based on my experience and my careers. First, as an investigative reporter for The Sun, I'd like to talk about corruption. the role of the free press and the rule of law. Second, as an advisor to a very senior Republican, I'd like to talk about Congress today, the separation of powers and the lack of bipartisanship, and what I believe is the decline of the Republican Party as a serious party. And third, as someone who did these war games on national security issues without any concern for party or partisan angle, we looked at everything from the collapse of the Soviet Union, 6 months before the Iraq invasion, democratization in South Korea and South Africa. Very pleased of some of the exercises we did because we correctly looked at very difficult issues in a nonpartisan way. We even did an exercise on Ethiopia's threat to dam the Nile in 1999, and that's just happening today. We were almost too far ahead of the curve, I'd say. But I do believe that, and I want to talk about the president's strengths and weaknesses, successes and failures. But first, talk about corruption. I was an investigative reporter for The Sun, and in 1970, the paper asked me to take a look at corruption in Baltimore, particularly Baltimore County. And I'll try to make a long story short, but my articles discovered that the county executive in Baltimore County, Dale Anderson, had basically been ruling in favor of a lot of rich developers, and in turn received heavy campaign contributions. I'd been told there were a lot of bribes flowing back and forth, but I couldn't prove it. But the articles did show a parallel, almost a quid pro quo between the amount of campaign contributions and the amount of land people were getting rezoned for development. Anderson, after I had gone to London, was investigated by the US attorney in, I guess I hadn't gone to London, but I didn't know about the depth of that investigation. But while he was being investigated, architects and engineers in Baltimore city and county said, well, yes, we did pay off Anderson, but we can give you a much bigger fish to fry if you give us immunity. And of course, the larger fish to fry was the person that Anderson had succeeded, now Vice President of the United States, Spiro Agnew. And it was in October 1973 that Agnew resigned. If he had hung on a little bit longer, the Saturday Night Massacre was only about 10 days later. If Agnew had been able to get an impeachment proceeding against him, which he tried to do in a desperate effort to get away from the investigation, he might have become president, given what happened to Nixon. One of the footnotes at the time was, I must say, I've always admired Bob Woodward, but at the time that I was covering Watergate after Agnew, it was very frustrating to have to chase Woodward and Bernstein around all the time. They had the advantage of being in Washington, but they also had the advantage of Deep Throat as a key source. I think it was the #2 person at the FBI. But I do think I know something about corruption. I think Donald Trump has been skating on thin ice for decades. You look at his record on casinos, the bankruptcies, look at David K. Johnson's book on the rise of Donald Trump, his serial abuse of laws and ethics. And now, despite Trump's determined efforts to bar disclosure of his taxes and financial records, the New York Times has laid out the reasons why he's been so determined to cover them up and keep them from the public eye. I don't need to detail, most of you I'm sure probably are aware of what the Times has reported, but it's pretty striking that this man didn't pay a cent of tax to the United States in 10 of the last 15 years. He paid a total of $750 in 2 recent years, 2015 and 2016, when he was running for president. Now he's insisted he paid millions. If you look closely, he's paid a lot of money to the Philippines, India, and other countries. I can't remember all of them, but often paid not anything to the United States. His financial records he was required to disclose do show a lot of revenue coming in, But what the Times now discloses is that he may have had a lot of revenues in those years, but he also had a lot of losses and write-offs, including a huge amount of money to his daughter Ivanka for consulting fees. Now, whether she consulted on the color of his hair or his financial dealings, I don't know, but that's one of the things I think the IRS is now investigating, is what's the legitimacy of those write-offs. The word corrupt does not strictly mean taking bribes. Its main definition is guilty of dishonest practices without integrity. Synonyms are dishonest, venal, tainted. And I don't think there's any honest person that can say that that's part of his record. You look at the Trump Foundation. He paid a $2 million fine a few years ago for transferring money that he raised from veterans to go to his charitable foundation, and he misused them to do everything from money going to his campaign, a painting of himself, and even Boy Scout dues for Donald John Trump. It went back that far. The New York Times documents this wheeling and dealing, and it's very explosive, and I think its timing coming out just before the debate is one of the reasons that he was probably so unhinged before the debate, during the debate. I expected him to try to be presidential and condescending towards Joe Biden. Instead, he just was determined to get in his crazy ideas about Biden and interrupt him anytime he had a chance to talk about policy issues. To me, the most urgent issue of corruption, though, is his relations with the Russians. And I guess as my 20 years at the State Department and 6 years as a foreign correspondent, years with Mac Mathias, I'm most concerned with national security, even more so than some of other issues. Trump's, after his bankrupt casinos, he started the hotel business. And it's useful to know that in the 80s, when he built Trump Tower, some of the first and largest investors in Trump Tower were the Russian mafia or Russian oligarchs. They bought lots of apartments in his Trump Tower. This is all laid out in a lot of different books, but the best one I can cite is Craig Unger of the New Republic, who wrote a book called House of Putin, House of Trump, which I highly recommend. But it documents the extent to which these investments were made. He also was in very grave financial trouble in 2007, 2008 during the financial meltdown. He survived, partly because of the TV reality show, The Apprentice, but also partly because Russian oligarchs were still plowing money into his enterprises. I don't think he or Trump or his son, Eric, are happy that Eric made this comment, but in 2008, Eric, during the financial crisis, Eric Trump said, "We don't need any money from American banks. We get plenty from Russia." I would just point out that the US national security strategy, the first one of the Trump administration, it still is in effect, and it's something that I used to take part in when I worked in the State Department and drafting for other administrations, says that Russia is a perilous foe whose leaders seek to undermine our country. And if that isn't happening, I think we're ignoring reality, as Trump and some others do. Dan Coates, a respected Republican who was national intelligence leader for 3 years, I think, before he got driven out because he criticized Trump's policies. Dan Coates told Bob Woodward that he believes Vladimir Putin has a lot of compromising material on Trump. That hasn't, who knows, that hasn't come out. But I don't think there's any doubt about his integrity or lack of integrity. I like what Robert Mueller said about integrity when he was appointed to head the Russian investigation. He said, the only thing that matters is your integrity, and the only thing that doesn't matter is your integrity. I may have garbled that, but it's a good quote worth looking up. On separation of powers, in my experience in Congress, the government, our Constitution set up three roughly co-equal branches of government, but in the nuclear age, it's obvious that the presidency has gained extensive, much more power with the growth of television and technology. And I would even argue that Congress, with the lack of compromise in the last 20, 30 years, is now the weakest branch. Partisan rancor has been common throughout our history. Look back at the days during the Depression, and particularly during the lead up to World War II, when you had a lot of people still in an isolationist mood who didn't want to grant Roosevelt the money to build up the forces we needed. And it took Pearl Harbor to finally change that attitude. But the current state of affairs in Congress, to me, is tragic. It's not easy to pin down its origins, but I would argue that it goes back to the rise of the Tea Party, even perhaps the Reagan administration, but more the Tea Party and Newt Gingrich and the readiness of, and the collision with the Clinton administration. Clinton's philandering didn't help it, but the willingness to shut down the government. The worst came to a head, I believe, during the Obama administration, and he's to blame somewhat, to my mind, for focusing on healthcare in the first 2 years, when he did a good job, I think, keeping the economy, restoring the economy, but focusing on the healthcare became a very divisive issue, and it might have been better if he'd waited till after his first 2 years. But Mitch McConnell declared in 2012 that the #1 priority of the Republican Party was to defeat Barack Obama. Had said nothing about the national interest or what needed to be done for American legislature. I'd like to quote from a very good book. It's in one of my chapters, but Norman Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute and Thomas Mann wrote an article in 2016. And their comment was, the Republican Party has become an insurgent outlier, ideologically extreme, contemptuous of an inherited social and economic regime, scornful of compromise, unpersuaded by conventional understanding of facts, evidence, and science, and dismissive of its political opposition. It is its self-inflicted wound, but one with disastrous consequences for us all, they wrote in March of 2016, before Trump. They basically predicted that Trump would become president. It's a very interesting, and Norman Ornstein is a very smart fellow. A word about bipartisanship, which is terribly lacking today. In 1985 and 86, when I worked for Mac Mathias, one of the most consequential acts of that period was the Anti-Apartheid Act with South Africa. At that time, the Democrats, including Joe Biden, were hidebound with pressing a sweeping set of sanctions against South Africa, not just stopping arms control, not just freeing Nelson Mandela, not just economic sanctions, but they wanted to close the US Embassy in South Africa. They wanted to stop South African Airways from flying to the United States. As Senator Mathias's principal foreign policy aide, and I would add that Chris Van Hollen, the current senator from Maryland, was my deputy. Chris and I worked with Senator Evans from Washington to talk to the Democratic leadership, Biden, John Kerry, Paul Sarbanes of Maryland, and convince them to drop some of the more extreme measures and try to work out a deal which could pass the Senate. It ended up, I believe, in a 9-9 tie in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but Richard Lugar, who had basically supported Reagan's constructive engagement policy on South Africa, a very slow-rolling, sort of sympathetic approach, Richard Lugar came around. The legislation passed the Senate. Ronald Reagan vetoed the legislation. At the height of Reagan's popularity in 1986, 31 Republicans joined the 47 Democrats. The split was almost the same as it is today, 53-47. But 31 Republicans joined the 47 Democrats to override Ronald Reagan's veto. And guess who was one of the 31 Republicans? A junior senator from Kentucky, Mitch McConnell. How things have changed. 5 years later, due to the impact of those sanctions, and it's one of the few times I think that sanctions actually have worked somewhat. De Klerk, the leader of South Africa, concerned about the fate of the country, basically resigned, and they turned the government over into majority rule, as it should have happened a long time ago. This was a period when Republican senators had a lot of courage, conviction, compassion, and were interested in compromise, and they were interested in the United States of America. People like Mathias, Jake Javits, Chuck Percy, Nancy Kassebaum, Richard Lugar, Bill Cohen. They all were people that were willing and put American interests first rather than the interests of a single person. And that's one of the reasons why I don't accept Susan Collins's ad about being the most bipartisan senator. If she's the most bipartisan senator among the Republicans or Democrats, it tells you a lot about the state of the Republican Party today. I would just like to quote from an article by a brilliant British columnist, Edward Luce, who said, probably a month or two ago, was a piece called Trump's Orwellian Jamboree in the Financial Times. There is no longer a Republican Party distinct from the cult of personality it has become. It is neither conservative nor of any other discernible ideology. It is what Mr. Trump says at any given moment. I think I will skip over but Collins's votes on Kavanaugh, on the tax cut, particularly were disturbing to me, particularly when the tax cut did nothing but enrich the 1 or 2% of the country, and at a time when disparity of wealth in this country has reached such outlandish proportions. The last issue I'd talk about is national security. It may not be front and center for a lot of voters in this election, and I can understand that. But I believe the standing of the United States, its security and active leadership in the world, especially its soft power, our values, and until now, our commitment to the rule of law and human rights. And I would point out the Declaration of Independence noted respect for the opinions of mankind are critical, and a grave threat from a person I believe is a reckless demagogue who doesn't really care that much about the country, but he's cared mostly about himself, his reelection, his power, and to protect himself from future prosecution. Donald Trump ran, and I would use his full name, and I'd be curious if anybody can figure out why I use his full name in the title of this book, The Failed Presidency of Donald John Trump. Ran and keeps running on a slogan called Make America Great Again. I think the facts are very clear that he is making America alone, not again, but particularly alone these days, in 4 years. I gave Trump the benefit of the doubt in the first 2 columns I wrote. I wrote a column about Rex Tillerson's appointment and Jim Mattis's appointment, his appointment of John Kelly, and eventually H.R. McMaster, but he was later. And said, even though I didn't think Rex Tillerson had much experience to run the State Department, he had been the chief executive of Exxon and was a smart guy. And the second column I wrote was about North Korea. And although I said Trump was a new slate or a blind slate, I said that this was probably his most challenging issue, and he did tackle it. But it didn't take long to discover that his idea of national security policy was not very effective. His love or affection for Russia and Vladimir Putin stands out to me Russia is committed the only aggression in Europe in World War II, only major aggression. Yugoslavia had a terrible civil war, but that was internal. Russia, except for its nuclear weapons and oil and gas reserves, is a fairly weak country. Its economy is the 13th largest in the world, half the size of California's GDP. Trump has shown no respect for hardworking professional civil servants. He called CIA agents Nazis early in his administration. He's practically destroyed part of the State Department. He's continually dismissed any FBI investigation that he doesn't like. And just on the beginning, the way he dealt with North Korea, I didn't argue that it was a bad idea to do that, but to do it without diplomatic preparation proved to be a disaster. I think one of his worst moments, and it tended to be repeated, was at Helsinki in 2018, when he basically said in this international, to an international audience, that he accepted the word of Vladimir Putin that they didn't interfere in the 2016 elections over his unanimous conclusion of all intelligence agencies. And a footnote on that, Republican friends of mine will say, oh, but the Mueller report has proved that there was no collusion. Well, the Mueller report proved that there was massive Russian interference. They didn't come out with the conclusion of collusion. And also the Senate Intelligence Committee, which has a majority of Republicans, has repeatedly confirmed that there was massive Russian interference. And Trump continues to call it a hoax instead of facing reality and moving on. Let me get to his top people have left: Mattis, Tillerson, John Kelly, Dan Coates. You now have not 50 leading Republican national security experts who say they will not vote or can't support Trump, but 70. The most dramatic illustrations of his lack of stability came, I think, in that Pentagon briefing in 2017, where he had a tantrum in front of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, called them dopes and babies. It was after that meeting that Rex Tillerson basically said he's a expletive-deleted moron. Richard Haass, a vice president, he's now president of the prestigious Council of Foreign Relations and a senior figure in many Republican administrations, basically sums up Trump's policies as the withdrawal doctrine. He withdrew from the TPP, he drew from NAFTA. Even the Wall Street Journal said the agreement to replace NAFTA was a failure. He withdrew from the Climate Accord, the Iran Agreement, the World Health Organization, and nuclear arms agreements. Putin's as much to blame for that as he is, but I would note that George Shultz, a Republican icon, has said that we are closer today to the doomsday midnight clock than ever before, even before the war and during the Cold War. And he blames the White House, not Moscow, for as much as anything. To me, one of the most, even when there was a proper target like China, Trump tried to do it by himself, the way he did with North Korea and his love letters with Kim Jong-un, which completely fell apart. On China, nobody would argue that their theft of intellectual property, their advances in technology, and refusal to play fair needed to be dealt with. But if he dealt with them with European cooperation, he would have made much greater success than he did, except ending up with a little small agreement, and now, of course, blaming the coronavirus on China. I'd just like the one other word about what to me is the most alarming attitude of Trump's in many ways on foreign policy, and that's his calling climate change a Chinese hoax. The Pentagon itself considers it probably one of the longest, the most serious long-term threat to the world's stability. Yet he continues to say, oh, it's the world's cooling. I would just point out to people that 5 of the last 6 years have been the warmest on Earth, that glaciers the size of Rhode Island are falling off of Greenland, and 90% or more than 90% of the scientists in the world consider global warming as a major cause of climate change. I think the same attitude towards science and health has been why he's had such a terrible time dealing with the coronavirus. He was warned in January by Robert O'Brien, his 4th national security advisor, and I have skipped going over the revolving door of people that were his advisors, getting to a lower and lower 3rd-rate and 4th-rate level of people. But that he was warned in January, and yet continued to say it would go away like a miracle. He called it a democratic hoax at one point. We have less than 5% of the population in the world, and I'm sure you all know this, and we have more than 20% of the deaths in the world. He came to Maine, as we all know, I guess, and called Janet Mills a dictator and blamed her for not reopening. Reopen, as he sat down with Paul LePage. Well, guess what? It's about that time all the governors in Florida, Texas, Nebraska, Arkansas, they all reopened, and their surge in deaths went up. And of course, I don't know, there's a lot of people out there who don't seem to care if people die. And his failure to recognize the health crisis and shut down, Florida has more deaths than Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and I'll add Tasmania put together. Just one state in this country, and that's not even the worst state as far as I know. The disdain for science and health is just terrible. We can't afford to continue on this role. He reduced the role of science and health in the National Security Council after he became president, and he's done the same thing throughout the government. He told Bob Woodward he didn't want to panic people. That was a rationalization he came up with after he had had a few times to think about it. Well, that's like the head of the Weather Service saying that, well, knowing there's a hurricane coming, but not telling anybody because they didn't want them to panic. I prefer the comment by James Fallows that President Trump was like a pilot who, with all the instruments and warnings and co-pilots that were telling him what was coming, James Fallows wrote in the Atlantic that Trump flew the country into a mountain. And that's what's happened. It's very sad. I'll close, just skip over a couple of points I wanted to make, but I'll close with a reference to Pew Research. Pew Research is probably one of the most credible, serious survey institutes in the world. And they recently published, and they do often, survey looking at interviewed 41,000 people in 37 countries around the world. And respect for the United States have plummeted under Trump. The European Trump, gotta look at my piece of paper here, I did write some of them down. European, less than 12 or 18% of the people in Europe have any confidence that Donald Trump could do the right thing in foreign policy. 75% of the people in Japan did not think he could do the right thing, and that was the highest rating of all of which have fallen dramatically under his term. I think that, and I did refer to the Declaration of Independence and how we should have respect for the opinions of mankind. And I think, Hannah, that's probably we ought to leave some time for questions and answers. And I'm sure that people would want to ask some questions. And I offer once again, anybody can tell me why I used his full name in my title. The full title of the book is Dereliction of Duty. And by the way, I didn't mean to, I wasn't stealing a title from H.R. McMaster, who wrote a brilliant book called Dereliction of Duty, which I'm sure some of you have read. It was about the failure of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to tell Johnson and Kennedy about the dangers and stakes in Vietnam. But did want to use that title, and also my subtitle was The Failed Presidency of Donald John Trump. And I will send a signed copy to anybody who can tell me why I use the middle name.
Thanks, Fred. That's a good challenge. So I'll stop the recording here and we'll move into Q&A.